It wasn't the first crack in the doorbing that broke her will. Nor was it the way the heavy pine beam over the door sagged another inch, promising a collapse that felt more like a slow surrender than a sudden catastrophe. It was the sound. A new sound, thin and high, a whistle that had found a fresh path through the northern wall of the cabin her husband had built. It was the sound of the wind, not just pushing against the house, but getting inside it, claiming it piece by piece. That sound promised a death not of violence, but of attrition. Anya knew then that more mud and more desperate patching would not be enough. The answer to the wind would not be found by fighting it head-on. It would be found, impossibly, through a dog's brief, sudden disobedience. Why Bodhi bolted that afternoon, a streak of gold against the grey rock, was a question she would not understand for hours. But the answer would not just save her life, it would quietly remake the life of her entire valley. It's good to have you with us today, wherever you're watching from. Let us know down below what part of the world you're in. We're glad you're here. The valley Anya called home was a hard place, carved by water and then forgotten by it, leaving behind a scoop of rocky soil that rewarded only the most stubborn. Her cabin, the last one up the trail before the land gave itself over entirely to scree and granite, was a testament to that stubbornness. It was also a monument to a man she was trying not to forget, but whose memory was being scoured away by the sheer effort of staying alive without him. Each day was a litany of tasks, splitting wood, checking snares, hauling water, and patching the ever-multiplying wounds in her home. The cold was a physical presence, a weight that leaned on the walls and pressed through the glass. It thinned the light and made the iron of the stove painful to touch. Bodhi, her golden retriever, felt it too. He no longer slept sprawled on the floorboards. He curled into a tight knot, nose tucked under his tail, a perfect sphere of conserved warmth. His stillness was a barometer of their dwindling chances. That afternoon, the wind whistle had become unbearable. Anya had thrown down her tools in a rare show of despair, the sound of the hammer clattering on the stone hearth echoing the hollowness inside her. That was when Bodhi, usually a steady shadow at her heel, had shot out the open door. She followed him, her initial shout of his name swallowed by a gust that tore the words from her mouth. Anger came first, hot and sharp. He knew better. Out here, obedience wasn't a trick, it was a tether to life. The wind was a physical force, pushing her sideways, whipping strands of her tightly bound hair across her face until they stung like needles. Bodhi was a blur, moving with a purpose she couldn't comprehend, not toward the sparse woods where rabbits might be, but straight up, toward the sheer rock faces that formed the valley's western wall. He scrambled up a trail of loose shale she had never dared to climb, his paws finding purchase where her boots would surely slip. She kept him in sight, her anger giving way to a cold spike of fear. The cliffs were a maze of fractures and dead ends. He could get trapped. He could fall. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She found a more gradual, safer path, pulling herself up by grasping at stunted, wind-scoured shrubs. Her knuckles were raw by the time she reached the ledge where he had disappeared. There was no sign of him. Only a dark slash in the rock, a fissure no wider than her shoulders. Bodhi, she called, her voice thin and tight. A muffled bark answered from within the stone itself. He was in there. Trapped. The fear solidified into a dreadful certainty. She dropped to her hands and knees, the sharp edges of the rock biting into her palms, and peered into the darkness. It was not a cave, not a hole. It was a crack, a deep, vertical wound in the mountain. She called his name again, and the answering bark was closer, eager. He wasn't trapped. He was waiting. Taking a steadying breath, she pushed her shoulders into the opening and began to crawl. The transition was absolute. One moment, the world was the howl of wind, a physical pressure that vibrated through bone and tooth. The next, it was gone. Utterly. The silence was so profound it felt like a sound in itself. It was the quiet of a root cellar, of a deep well, of a place the world could not touch. She was in a narrow, tall passage, a geological hallway carved into the mountain's core. The air was still. Not just calm. It was motionless, and degrees warmer than the air just a few feet behind her. Bodhi nudged her hand with his wet nose, his tail thumping a soft, steady rhythm against the rock wall. He was not panicked. He was content. Anya sat back on her heels, the rough stone cool against her back, and simply listened to the nothing. Outside, the wind shrieked, a distant, powerless complaint. Inside, there was only the sound of her own breathing and the soft panting of her dog. She ran a hand over the rock. It was dry, solid granite. Looking up, she saw the fissure continued for 20, maybe 30 feet, before it was capped by a massive, unmoving slab of stone that formed a natural roof. The passage itself ran deep into the mountain, straight as a surveyor's line for at least 50 feet before turning. It was wider than it looked from the outside, a consistent 4 paces across. It was a shelter. Not just a shelter. It was an answer. A different kind of answer than the one she had been looking for. She had been trying to build a stronger wall against the wind. The mountain was showing her how to build a wall of stillness instead. An idea, quiet and radical, began to form. She wouldn't just use this place. She would live in it. She backed out of the crevice into the raging wind, the cold a sudden shock, and looked at the mountain with new eyes. It was not an obstacle anymore. It was a foundation. She spent the rest of the afternoon measuring. She used her own stride to gauge the length and width, scratching crude marks into the dusty floor of the passage with a sharp rock. The space was long and narrow, but consistent. It would be tight, but it would be possible. A cabin, built not on the land, but in it. A wooden box tucked inside a stone one. The next morning, she walked the 2 miles to the small cluster of buildings that passed for a settlement. The mill, run by a man named Abram, was her destination. Abram was the valley's unofficial authority on all things built. He had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a saw blade years ago, an injury that people said had sharpened his judgment and soured his temper in equal measure. He stood watching the great water wheel turn, his posture as unyielding as the mountains behind him. Anya stood quietly until he acknowledged her, a habit learned from the men of this place. "I need timber," she said, her voice clear and steady. He grunted, turning his gaze on her. "For the cabin? Patching it again?" "No," she said. "I'm building a new one." That got his attention. He straightened up from the railing he was leaning on. "Building where?" "There's no good land left up your way," she explained her plan. She spoke of the crevice, the stillness, the way the rock itself would be the outer walls. She described the long, narrow structure she envisioned nestled inside it. He listened, his face betraying nothing, until she was finished. Then he gave a short, hard laugh that was entirely without humor. "A tomb," he said, loud enough for the 2 men stacking lumber nearby to hear. "You want to build yourself a wooden coffin and slide it into a crack in the rock." He shook his head, a gesture of finality. "The damp will rot the wood in a year. The rock will sweat in the summer and weep ice in the winter. It's a fool's idea, girl." The men nearby stopped their work to watch. Anya felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained even. "The rock is dry. And there is no wind." "There's always wind," he scoffed. "And there's always a reason a place is empty. You'd be wise to remember that." He turned his back to her, a clear dismissal. "I'll pay for the timber," she said to his unmoving shoulders. "It's your money to waste," he muttered without looking back. His public scorn was a heavy stone, but as she walked away, it settled not as a burden, but as ballast. His certainty in her failure became the foundation of her resolve. The first haul was a lesson in humility. The cut timber, rough and heavy, seemed to possess a malevolent weight. What one man could carry with ease felt like an anchor to her. She couldn't manage the long beams alone, so she started with the shorter planks for the flooring, tying them with rope and dragging them behind her like a stubborn animal. The 2-mile trek from the mill back to her cabin was hard enough. The final half-mile, a steep, winding ascent to the crevice, was brutal. Each step was a negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. The plank snagged on rocks and roots. The rope cut into her shoulder. By the time she reached the mouth of the fissure, her lungs burned and her muscles screamed in protest. Bodhi, who had trotted ahead, sat waiting, his patient gaze a silent form of encouragement. She slid the first planks into the deep quiet of the passage, the sound of their scraping against the stone unnaturally loud in the stillness. Then she went back for more. The work found a rhythm dictated by her own limits. Haul, rest. Haul, rest. The sun arced across the sky, its light growing thinner, the shadows of the peaks stretching across the valley floor. Doubt was a constant companion, a cold whisper that echoed Abram's dismissive laugh. A coffin of rock. The damp will rot it. A fool's idea. She fought it by focusing on the immediate task. The splintered texture of the wood. The strain in her back. The solid feel of the ground beneath her worn boots. Bodhi became her clock. When he lay down with a heavy sigh, she knew it was time to rest. When he rose, shook himself, and looked down the path, she knew it was time to go again. He never ventured far, staying within sight, a silent, watchful guardian of her grueling, solitary labor. As dusk began to bleed purple into the sky, she sat on a pile of newly delivered planks, too tired to even make her way back down to her old cabin for the night. She was surrounded by the raw materials of a home that existed only in her mind, a ghost of a structure in a fissure of stone. The sheer scale of what she was attempting to do settled upon her, a weight far heavier than any timber. It felt impossible. It felt necessary. The work was a chisel, chipping away at everything but the essential. It stripped her of softness, of idle thoughts. Her hands, already calloused, grew thick and hard, the skin splitting at the knuckles. A deep, permanent ache settled into her lower back. One afternoon, while wrestling a particularly awkward piece of framing into place, the scent of fresh-cut pine, sharp and clean, filled the air. It was a smell from another life. A flash of memory, unbidden and sharp as glass, her husband, Samuel, planing a board, the pale curls of wood falling at his feet. His scent, of sawdust and sweat and quiet satisfaction. The memory wasn't sad. It was just there. A fact, like the granite walls around her. It didn't weaken her. It steadied her. He had known how to build things that lasted. She would too. It was on the third day of this punishing labor that help arrived, unasked for. She was halfway up the final ascent, dragging a heavy joist that kept catching on the terrain, when she felt the weight suddenly lighten. She looked back, startled, to see a young man, little more than a boy, with his hands on the other end of the beam. It was Thomas, a quiet lad who did odd jobs around the settlement. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his expression serious, and nodded up the trail. Anya nodded back. Words were unnecessary. He had seen the need and met it. From then on, he appeared every morning, just as she was beginning her first trip from the woodpile she'd staged at the base of the mountain. He was as silent as she was, his presence a steady, uncomplaining force. He was strong, his youth a reservoir of energy she lacked. Together, they could move the longer, heavier beams that would form the main structure. He seemed to understand the geometry of the task without instruction, anticipating where the weight needed to shift, how to angle a beam to get it through the narrow opening. He never asked about the purpose of the strange building. He never questioned the location. He simply attached himself to the work, carrying tools, carrying timber, and, in his quiet way, carrying a share of the burden. His trust was a silent rebuke to Abram's scorn. He was the first to see it not as a folly, but as a construction site. With Thomas's help, the frame began to rise. Inside the stone passage, the skeleton of a long, narrow house took shape. It was a strange and wonderful thing to see, the pale, straight lines of the pine against the dark, ancient granite. Anya had designed it with care. The wooden walls didn't touch the stone, she left a gap of a few inches, an airspace she hoped would prevent the damp that Abram had warned of. The floor was raised on short joists, lifting it off the rock. It was slow, exacting work. Every cut had to be precise, every joint secure. A mistake couldn't be easily fixed. One afternoon, as she was struggling to fit a roof rafter, a shadow fell over her. She looked down from the short ladder to see Martha, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard seasons and quiet observation. Martha said nothing about the structure. She carried no words of praise or doubt. Instead, she held out a small, covered pot. "Stew," she said. It was her only comment on Anya's welfare. Then, she looked at the saw lying on the floor. "Your blade is dull," she stated, not as a criticism, but as a fact. "You're wasting strength." She produced a small, smooth whetstone from her apron pocket and handed it to Anya. "Sharpen it every hour." A sharp tool does half the work. Anya took the stone, its coolness a welcome sensation in her aching hand. Martha watched her for a moment, her gaze taking in the neatly stacked lumber, the tight-fitting joints of the frame, the sleeping dog curled by the entrance. She gave a single, small nod. It was not approval. It was acknowledgement. The stew was hot and rich with rabbit meat. The whetstone, when Anya drew it across the teeth of her saw, sang a high, clear note. The next cut she made was clean and fast, the wood parting with an ease that felt like a revelation. Martha's practical gift, her quiet witness, was more fortifying than 100 words of encouragement. It was the acceptance of a fellow survivor, a recognition that this strange, impossible act was, above all else, a piece of serious work. By the last week of October, the sky had turned the color of lead. The wind, which had been a constant pressure, began to build in strength, carrying the first stinging pellets of ice. A storm was coming. The first real storm of the season. Down in the settlement, smoke from the chimneys blew horizontal. Doors were barred, livestock brought into barns. From her vantage point on the mountain, Anya could see the valley preparing for a siege. Her own structure was not yet finished. The roof was framed but only half-sheathed, and the spaces for the door and a small window were empty gaps. There was no time to get back to the old cabin. There was nowhere to go but in. She and Bodhi retreated into the half-finished shell inside the crevice as the storm broke. The sound was immense. Outside the narrow mouth of the fissure, the world became a white chaos of wind and snow. The howl was a physical thing, a solid wall of noise that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. But it was all outside. Inside the crevice, the air remained utterly, unnervingly still. The roar was muffled, a deep bass rumble that came from a great distance. There was no vibration in the rock, no draft, no whistle of air forcing its way through cracks. Anya sat on a stack of planks, her arms wrapped around her knees, and watched the snow swirl violently past the opening at the far end of the passage. It was like watching the storm through a window in a fortress. Bodhi, who would have been a trembling, panting wreck in the old cabin, lay at her feet. His head was on his paws, his breathing slow and even. He lifted his head once, listening to the distant fury, then let out a soft sigh and closed his eyes. His calm was the final, irrefutable proof. The theory had become fact. Here, the wind had no power. Here, the storm could not reach. She was not in a tomb. She was in a sanctuary. The cold was still intense, the raw cold of the deep rock, but it was a simple, honest cold. It was not the biting, invasive cold carried on the wind. It was a stillness she could fight with layers and, eventually, with a stove. The storm raged for 2 days. For 2 days, she and Bodhi lived in the profound quiet, watching the blizzard spend its fury on the world outside. When the storm finally broke, the silence that followed was different. It was the deep, muffled quiet of a world buried in snow. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The air was frigid and sharp. Anya emerged from the crevice into a landscape transformed, a world of white drifts and glittering ice. She expected to be alone for days, the trail impassable. But by midday, she saw a figure slowly making its way up the mountain, pausing often, testing his footing in the deep snow. It was Abram. He carried a long pole, probing the drifts ahead of him, his progress slow and deliberate. She watched him come, unsure of his purpose. Was it to gloat? To see the ruin of her folly, crushed by the first storm? He finally reached the ledge, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his face chapped red by the cold. He stopped, leaning on his pole, and simply stared. He saw her, not huddled and freezing, but standing straight. He saw the unfinished but intact structure behind her. He saw Bodhi emerge from the opening, stretch languidly, and shake a fine dusting of snow from his coat. Abram walked to the mouth of the crevice and stood there, his hand resting on the cold granite. He tilted his head, listening to the silence within, while the faintest breeze whispered past him on the outside. He looked at Anya. He looked at her work. He walked into the passage, his boots crunching softly on the dusty stone floor. He ran his three-fingered hand over a joint she had made. He looked up at the rafters, his practiced eye taking in every angle, every space. He didn't speak for a long time. Anya waited, letting the quiet do the work. "Your joists are too far apart," he said finally, his voice rough. "You'll lose heat through the floor." He wasn't insulting her. He was correcting her. He was teaching her. He pulled a piece of chalk and a folded rule from his coat pocket. He made a mark on the floor beam. 16 inches on center. No more. It was not an apology. It was an acceptance. He had come expecting to find a disaster, but had found an innovation instead. And his pride as a craftsman could not allow a good idea to be executed badly. He was joining the work. Abram's arrival changed the character of the work. It went from being an act of solitary desperation to a project of communal engineering. He returned the next day not alone, but with Thomas, and a sled loaded with proper tools, a heavy crosscut saw, a framing square, a level, and adze. He was a demanding teacher, his instructions short and precise. "No, not like that. Let the tool do the work. Measure twice. You can't make a board longer." Thomas, who had worked in silent deference to Anya, now worked in silent observation of Abram, his eyes absorbing every lesson. The pace quickened. The work grew more refined. Under Abram's guidance, the structure became less a rustic shelter and more a piece of fine carpentry, fitted perfectly to its stone container. News of the project, and Abram's surprising involvement, traveled through the valley on unseen currents. One morning, Mr. Davies, a farmer from the lowlands who had been one of the men laughing at Abram's coffin remark, appeared at the work site. He was a man known for his stubborn adherence to tradition. He trudged up the snowy path, a heavy bundle of hand-split cedar shingles on his back. He said nothing to Anya or Abram. He simply dropped the bundle near the entrance, turned around, and began the long walk back down. The gesture was louder than any words. It was a contribution. An admission. Later that week, Martha returned, this time with 2 heavy wool blankets and a small, cast-iron stove, salvaged from a collapsed trapper's cabin. "It draws well," was all she said, "but the door latch is loose. You'll need to fix it." A home was being built, not just by Anya, but by the slow, turning consensus of the community. They came not with charity for a widow, but with respect for a sound design. They were a practical people, and they recognized a practical solution when they saw one, even if it was one they had first dismissed. The cabin was finished under a cold, bright November sun. It was a marvel of efficiency, a long, clean line of wood inside a long, clean line of stone, the small stovepipe vented cleverly through a natural crack in the ceiling rock. It was a home born of a dog's instinct, a woman's desperation, and a community's reluctant, pragmatic wisdom. Winter settled into the valley, deep and absolute. The world outside the crevice was a place of brutal, howling winds and temperatures that could freeze a man solid in hours. The old cabin Anya had abandoned was now just a snow hump, its broken roof caved in, its walls breached. It had been defeated. But inside her new home, a different reality existed. The small stove provided a steady, radiant warmth that the insulated walls and still air held close. The silence was the most profound luxury. It was a quiet so deep it felt like a presence, a soft blanket over the world. Anya could sit at her small table, mending a shirt, and watch through the single, perfectly placed window as the snow blew past the mouth of the crevice in a horizontal fury. She could see the storm, but she could not feel it. She could hear its distant, rumbling voice, but it could not touch her. Bodhi slept near the stove, not curled in a tight ball of anxious preservation, but sprawled on his side, his legs twitching as he dreamed. He was safe. They were safe. She had not conquered the mountain. She had listened to it. She had not defeated the wind. She had stepped out of its way. The answer had not been in more strength, more wood, more fight. It had been in a small, strange, overlooked place that everyone else had dismissed as useless. That is how it often works, for all of us. The solutions to our greatest pressures are rarely found where we exert the most force. They are found in the quiet places we almost missed, in the strange ideas we were told to discard, in the truths that a trusted companion, if we are wise enough to follow, will lead us to. It is the wisdom not of the storm, but of the stone. A quiet, patient, and enduring strength that is there for anyone with the humility to look for it.